Welcome to Mr. What If, where we explore strange questions and impossible worlds. Comment where you're listening from, and share your own what if ideas below. Now, let's begin. What if gravity suddenly doubled overnight? If Earth's gravity suddenly doubled from 9.8 to 19.6 meters per second squared, the immediate effects would be catastrophic and far-reaching. Within the first hour, every human on Earth would experience crushing pressure equivalent to carrying their exact body weight on their back permanently. A 150-pound person would feel like they weigh 300 pounds instantly. The human body would face immediate physiological crisis. Blood circulation would become severely strained as the heart struggles to pump blood upward against doubled gravitational pull. Most people would experience fainting, difficulty breathing, and potential heart failure within minutes. Those with existing cardiovascular conditions would be at extreme risk. Standing would become nearly impossible for most adults, and walking would require tremendous effort. Buildings and infrastructure would begin failing within hours. Skyscrapers designed for normal gravity would experience structural stress beyond their engineering limits. Glass windows would shatter from the increased pressure. Bridges would sag and potentially collapse as their load-bearing calculations become obsolete. Water towers would buckle under doubled water weight. Power lines would snap from increased tension. The transportation sector would face immediate paralysis. Cars would struggle to accelerate as their engines work against doubled weight. Fuel consumption would skyrocket. Aircraft would be grounded indefinitely. Planes designed for standard gravity couldn't generate enough lift to overcome the increased gravitational pull. Ships would sit lower in water, potentially taking on water and sinking. Within 24 hours, the global economy would collapse. Supply chains would break down as trucks can't carry normal loads. Food distribution would halt. Elevators would fail or become dangerously slow. Emergency services would be overwhelmed and largely ineffective as ambulances and fire trucks struggle to respond. The elderly and physically weak would be the first casualties. Children would be immobilized. Hospitals would overflow with patients suffering from circulation failure, bone fractures from falls, and respiratory distress. Medical equipment would malfunction as drips flow differently and life support systems struggle with altered pressure dynamics. Agriculture would be devastated. Crops would be crushed under their own doubled weight. Fruit trees would snap. Livestock would suffer severe stress, with many animals unable to support their own body weight. Food production would cease almost immediately. Ocean levels would change dramatically. Water would redistribute, flowing more rapidly toward the poles due to increased gravitational pull. Coastal areas might experience unusual tidal patterns. Atmospheric pressure would increase, potentially affecting weather systems and breathing at higher altitudes. After 1 week, assuming some humans survived the initial shock, adaptation would begin. Only the strongest individuals would remain mobile. Society would reorganize around ground-level living as stairs become nearly impossible to climb. Wheelchairs and mobility devices would become essential for everyone. New technologies would emerge out of necessity. Exoskeletons and mechanical assistance devices would be developed rapidly. Architecture would shift toward single-story, heavily reinforced structures. Transportation would rely on ground-based systems designed for much heavier loads. Food production would require complete redesign. Hydroponic systems would replace traditional farming. Livestock would need to be genetically modified or replaced with smaller animals better suited to high-gravity environments. Human reproduction would be severely impacted. Pregnancy would become extremely dangerous as women's bodies struggled to support doubled fetal weight. Birth rates would plummet, threatening long-term human survival. Long-term adaptation would take generations. Humans would evolve to be shorter and more muscular. Bone density would increase. Cardiovascular systems would adapt to handle increased pressure. Children born in doubled gravity would develop differently from birth. Technology would advance rapidly in specific areas, materials science, mechanical assistance, and medical support systems. However, overall technological progress would slow as resources shift toward basic survival needs. The doubled gravity scenario would fundamentally reshape human civilization, forcing a complete restructuring of society, technology, and human biology itself. Only through rapid adaptation and technological innovation could humanity hope to survive this dramatic change in our planet's fundamental physical properties. What if every human had a visible countdown clock showing their time left to live? If every human suddenly developed a visible countdown clock showing their exact time remaining alive, society would undergo immediate and fundamental transformation. These clocks, presumably appearing as digital displays on people's foreheads or wrists, would display years, months, days, hours, and minutes until death. The immediate psychological impact would be devastating. Suicide rates would initially spike as people with short timers face existential despair. Conversely, those with long timers might experience survivor's guilt or become reckless, believing they're invulnerable until their time runs out. Mental health services would be overwhelmed within days. Healthcare systems would completely restructure. Doctors would no longer need to diagnose terminal illnesses, the countdown would reveal everything. Medical priorities would shift from diagnosis to comfort care and life extension research. Hospitals would segregate patients by time remaining, creating a new form of medical triage based on countdown clocks rather than injury severity. Insurance industries would collapse overnight. Life insurance becomes pointless when death dates are known. Health insurance would require complete recalculation as companies know exactly how much care each person will need. Actuarial tables would become obsolete, replaced by direct countdown readings. The legal system would face unprecedented challenges. Courts would need to determine if countdown clocks constitute evidence in murder cases. If someone's timer suddenly decreases, it could indicate impending murder. Preventive arrests might become common. The justice system would struggle with whether people can be charged for crimes they haven't yet committed but will definitely commit according to their countdown. Employment would be revolutionized. Employers would inevitably discriminate based on countdown times, preferring workers with longer timers. Career planning would become either meaningless or hyper-focused. People with short timers might be denied promotions or training opportunities. Labor laws would need immediate revision to prevent countdown-based discrimination. Financial systems would need complete overhaul. Banks would adjust loan terms based on countdown clocks. People with short timers couldn't get long-term mortgages. Investment strategies would be based on known lifespans rather than projected returns. The stock market would become wildly volatile as investors make decisions based on key figures' countdown clocks. Relationships would be fundamentally altered. Dating would become a calculus of compatible countdown times. People might avoid relationships with those who have significantly shorter timers to avoid inevitable heartbreak. Conversely, some might seek out those with similar countdown times for shared experiences. Marriage vows would take on new meaning when couples know exactly how much time they have together. Education would adapt to individual countdown clocks. Students with short timers might receive accelerated programs focusing on essential skills. Those with long timers might pursue extended education. Career counseling would become countdown-based, directing people toward professions they can complete within their remaining time. Crime patterns would shift dramatically. Those with very short timers might commit crimes believing they won't face long-term consequences. Alternatively, knowing their exact death date might make some people more law-abiding, not wanting to waste precious time in prison. Murder rates might decrease as potential killers see their own countdown decrease when contemplating violence. Religious institutions would face theological crises. Questions about free will versus predestination would become practical rather than philosophical. Some might view countdown clocks as divine revelation, while others would see them as challenges to faith. New religious movements would likely emerge around countdown interpretation. Economic inequality would intensify. Those with longer timers would accumulate more wealth and power. Society might develop a new class system based on remaining time rather than current wealth. Time inequality would become a social justice issue. Scientific research would accelerate dramatically. Researchers with short timers would work frantically to complete projects. Those with long timers might be recruited for extended research programs. Medical research would focus intensely on extending or pausing countdown clocks. Governments would need to address countdown-based discrimination through legislation. New civil rights movements would emerge around chronological equality. International relations might shift as countries with populations having generally longer or shorter timers gain or lose influence. The countdown clock scenario would create a world where death awareness becomes the central organizing principle of society, fundamentally altering every aspect of human civilization from personal relationships to global politics. What if no one could speak, only write to communicate? If humans suddenly lost the ability to speak but retained all other faculties, society would undergo immediate and comprehensive transformation. The silence would be deafening as 7.8 billion people simultaneously lose their voices, forcing humanity to adapt to purely written communication. The immediate impact would be chaos. Emergency services would struggle to function as 911 calls become impossible. Police, firefighters, and paramedics would need rapid deployment of text-based emergency systems. Hospitals would face critical communication breakdowns during surgeries and emergency procedures where spoken commands are essential. Many people would initially die from medical emergencies that could have been prevented with verbal communication. Education systems would collapse temporarily. Teachers couldn't lecture, students couldn't ask questions aloud, and classroom discussions would disappear. Within weeks, schools would reorganize around written instruction. Whiteboards and paper would become precious resources. Digital devices would be essential, transforming every classroom into a computer lab. Educational methods would shift toward visual learning, demonstrations, and written exercises. The workplace would face unprecedented challenges. Meetings would become lengthy written exchanges. Phone-based jobs would vanish overnight, creating massive unemployment in customer service, sales, and communications sectors. Video conferences would become silent slide presentations. Productivity would initially plummet as all verbal processes convert to written ones. Transportation would require immediate safety overhauls. Air traffic control couldn't guide planes verbally. Train conductors couldn't announce stations. Bus drivers couldn't communicate with passengers. New visual and written systems would need rapid implementation to prevent accidents. Traffic would initially become chaotic as drivers couldn't communicate through windows or with traffic officers. The entertainment industry would be revolutionized. Radio would become obsolete. Television would rely entirely on text, subtitles, and visual content. Movies would return to silent film techniques with sophisticated visual storytelling. Music would become purely instrumental, eliminating vocals entirely. Theater would transform into elaborate mime and visual performance art. Law enforcement would face significant obstacles. Police couldn't verbally de-escalate situations. Court proceedings would become entirely written affairs. Witness testimony would be submitted in writing. The legal system would slow dramatically as all oral arguments convert to written briefs. Jury deliberations would become written discussions, potentially taking much longer to reach verdicts. Family dynamics would change profoundly. Parents couldn't verbally soothe crying children or give quick instructions. Bedtime stories would become reading sessions. Family dinners would become silent affairs or require constant note-passing. Child development would be affected as children lose verbal interaction crucial for language development, though they would still develop written communication skills. Technology would advance rapidly in specific areas. Text-to-speech software would become obsolete, but speech-to-text would remain valuable for those who can still think in spoken words. Instant messaging, email, and written communication platforms would see explosive growth. New communication technologies would emerge, possibly including advanced gesture recognition systems and visual communication tools. Sign language would become the primary alternative to writing. Deaf communities would suddenly become communication experts, teaching hearing populations alternative communication methods. Sign language interpreters would be in unprecedented demand. Society would rapidly develop new standardized gesture systems for common communications. Healthcare would require fundamental restructuring. Doctors couldn't verbally explain procedures or comfort patients. Medical consultations would become written exchanges. Therapy would shift to written analysis and correspondence. Mental health treatment would be revolutionized as talk therapy becomes impossible. Religious institutions would transform completely. Sermons would become written presentations. Prayer would remain silent or written. Singing would disappear from religious services. Religious leaders would need to develop new ways to provide spiritual guidance without spoken words. Social interactions would become more deliberate and thoughtful. Casual conversations would disappear. People would need to plan communications more carefully. Social media would become the primary platform for human interaction. Dating would rely entirely on written communication, potentially leading to deeper intellectual connections before physical meetings. Crime investigation would change dramatically. Police couldn't interrogate suspects verbally. Confessions would be entirely written. Undercover work would become nearly impossible without spoken conversation. Criminal organizations would need to develop new communication methods. International relations would be affected as diplomatic negotiations become purely written affairs. Translation services would focus entirely on written languages. Cultural exchange would rely on written communication and visual arts. The loss of speech would ultimately force humanity to develop more sophisticated written communication systems, potentially leading to more thoughtful, deliberate interactions while fundamentally restructuring every aspect of society around visual and written communication methods. What if people stopped aging after 25? If human aging suddenly ceased at age 25, with people maintaining their physical prime indefinitely while still being capable of death through injury or disease, society would undergo the most dramatic transformation in human history. The immediate effects would be barely noticeable, but within decades, the consequences would reshape every aspect of civilization. The first major impact would be on population dynamics. Without natural death from aging, the global population would explode exponentially. Current mortality rates would plummet by approximately 90%, as most deaths result from age-related diseases. Within 50 years, Earth's population could reach 20 to 30 billion people, creating unprecedented strain on resources, housing, and infrastructure. Economic systems would collapse and require complete reconstruction. The concept of retirement would become meaningless as people remain physically capable of working indefinitely. Social security and pension systems would go bankrupt immediately. The job market would become impossibly competitive as positions never open up through retirement. Career advancement would stagnate as senior positions remain occupied indefinitely. Family structures would be revolutionized. Traditional generational hierarchies would disappear as great-great-grandparents remain physically identical to their descendants. Family trees would become impossibly complex as individuals accumulate hundreds of descendants over centuries. Marriage would require redefinition as, till death do us part, becomes potentially millennia-long commitments. Healthcare would shift focus entirely from age-related diseases to injury prevention and infectious disease control. Medical research would redirect toward trauma care and disease prevention. Hospitals would need fewer geriatric facilities but more emergency care for the accidents and injuries that would become the primary causes of death. Mental health services would expand dramatically as people cope with potentially eternal existence. Education would require fundamental restructuring. People would have centuries to accumulate knowledge and skills. University systems would need to accommodate students who might pursue dozens of different degrees over their lifespans. Professional licensing and certification would become complex as individuals could master multiple fields. The concept of lifelong learning would become literal. Resource consumption would reach crisis levels. Housing would become critically scarce as people never vacate homes through natural death. Food production would need to increase dramatically to feed an ever-growing population. Environmental degradation would accelerate as resource demands multiply without corresponding population decreases through natural death. Legal systems would require complete overhaul. Prison sentences would need recalibration for potentially immortal individuals. Property inheritance laws would become meaningless as people never die to pass on assets. Democracy would face challenges as political leaders could potentially hold power for centuries if continually re-elected. Innovation might initially accelerate as brilliant minds continue working indefinitely. However, progress could also stagnate as established experts never retire, potentially blocking new ideas. Scientific advancement would depend on whether intellectual flexibility remains intact without aging. Social inequality would intensify dramatically. Those with wealth and power at the point of immortality would have centuries to accumulate more resources. Class mobility would decrease as established hierarchies never change through natural death. Economic inequality could become permanent and extreme. Mental health would become a critical issue. Many people would struggle with the concept of eternal existence. Depression, anxiety, and existential crises would likely increase as individuals face potentially endless repetition of daily life. New psychological disorders might emerge related to extreme longevity. Cultural evolution would slow dramatically. Social change often occurs as older generations die and younger ones implement new ideas. Without generational turnover, cultural progress might stagnate. Traditional values and beliefs could become permanently entrenched. Religion would face theological crises. Most religious concepts involve afterlife beliefs that would become irrelevant if people never die naturally. New spiritual movements would likely emerge to address eternal earthly existence. Questions about the meaning of life would become even more complex. Governments would need to implement population control measures. Reproduction would likely be regulated to prevent complete resource depletion. Birth permits or reproduction licenses might become necessary. International conflicts could arise over resource allocation and living space. Technology would advance rapidly in specific areas, space exploration would become essential for finding new habitable worlds, resource extraction would need to become more efficient, and virtual reality might become popular as people seek new experiences after centuries of existence. The ultimate outcome would depend on humanity's ability to expand beyond Earth. Without space colonization, the immortal scenario would likely lead to resource wars, authoritarian population control, and potentially civilizational collapse. With successful space expansion, it could lead to unprecedented human achievement and exploration of the universe. What if aliens existed? If definitive proof of alien existence was discovered tomorrow, the confirmation would trigger immediate and far-reaching consequences across every aspect of human civilization. The discovery method would determine initial reactions. Whether through radio signals, physical contact, or archaeological evidence would shape humanity's response. The immediate global reaction would be widespread panic and social disruption. Stock markets would crash as investors flee to perceived safe havens. Religious institutions would face theological crises as many belief systems struggle to incorporate non-terrestrial life. Government stability would be threatened as citizens demand answers and explanations their leaders cannot provide. Scientific communities would experience unprecedented upheaval. The discovery would validate decades of SETI research while simultaneously making many scientific assumptions obsolete. Funding would flood into astronomy, astrobiology, and xenology programs. Scientific priorities would shift dramatically toward understanding alien technology, biology, and communication methods. Religious institutions would face existential challenges. Many theological frameworks would require fundamental revision to incorporate non-human intelligence. Some religions might claim vindication if their texts mention otherworldly beings, while others would struggle with doctrines about human uniqueness. New religious movements would likely emerge around alien contact. Military and defense establishments would react with extreme caution. If aliens possess interstellar travel technology, their capabilities would far exceed human military power. Defense spending would shift toward space-based systems. International cooperation would likely increase as nations recognize the need for unified planetary defense. Economic systems would be destabilized. Industries related to space technology would boom while others might collapse. If aliens possess advanced technology, entire economic sectors could become obsolete overnight. Labor markets would shift toward space-related research and development. Currency systems might be affected if aliens introduce new economic concepts. Legal frameworks would require complete overhaul. International law would need expansion to address interplanetary relations. Questions about alien rights, territorial sovereignty, and legal jurisdiction would demand immediate attention. New legal specializations would emerge around xenological law and interplanetary relations. Educational systems would undergo massive revision. History curricula would need updates to reflect humanity's place in a larger cosmic context. New academic fields would emerge studying alien languages, cultures, and technologies. Scientific education would expand to include xenobiology and astroengineering. Technological development would accelerate dramatically. Even minimal exposure to alien technology could advance human capabilities by decades or centuries. Energy, transportation, communication, and materials science would likely benefit. However, technological inequality between nations with and without alien contact could create new forms of international tension. Social psychology would be profoundly affected. Human identity would need redefinition in the context of not being alone in the universe. Mental health services would see increased demand as people cope with existential anxiety. Social movements might emerge around human unity in the face of alien contact. Communication challenges would be enormous. If aliens use different communication methods, developing translation systems would become humanity's highest priority. Linguists, mathematicians, and computer scientists would collaborate on unprecedented scales to establish meaningful contact. Cultural evolution would accelerate rapidly. Art, literature, and entertainment would be revolutionized by awareness of alien existence. New forms of expression would emerge attempting to capture the alien experience. Cultural exchange programs with aliens could fundamentally alter human perspectives. International relations would be transformed. The discovery would likely reduce terrestrial conflicts as nations recognize shared human interests. A world government or enhanced United Nations might emerge to coordinate planetary responses. However, competition for alien technology or favor could create new conflicts. Environmental policy would gain urgency. If aliens possess advanced environmental management techniques, Earth's ecological problems might become solvable. Alternatively, if alien contact increases human space travel, environmental concerns might shift toward terraforming and planetary preservation. Economic inequality could either decrease through shared alien benefits or increase dramatically if certain groups gain preferential access to alien technology. Social justice movements would likely emerge around equitable alien contact and technology distribution. Long-term consequences would depend on alien intentions and capabilities. Benevolent aliens could accelerate human development and solve major global problems. Hostile aliens could threaten human survival. Indifferent aliens might simply observe, leaving humanity to adapt psychologically to cosmic insignificance. The discovery would ultimately unite humanity around shared cosmic citizenship while simultaneously creating new forms of division around alien contact access and interpretation. Human civilization would never return to pre-contact norms, instead entering a new phase of development defined by awareness of our place in a populated universe. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, come back next time for another What If to ponder. Until then, stay curious.